confidence feels earned. But Daniel Kahneman argues that this feeling can be misleading, not because people are incapable of reasoning or that we're irrational in any dramatic sense, but because confidence often reflects coherence rather than evidence. When a story makes sense and it forms a tight, internally consistent narrative, the mind registers that consistency as truth. When a conclusion comes together smoothly, when the pieces of a situation appear to fit and no internal contradictions interrupt the flow of thought, the resulting certainty feels justified. It feels as though sufficient reasoning has taken place, as though the mind has weighed what mattered and reached a stable position. The intuitive belief is that certainty grows in proportion to information. We assume that strong conviction signals strong evidence, that clarity reflects depth of analysis. We also assume that experienced professionals are confident because their understanding is more complete. That feels reasonable because the experience of confidence is rarely accompanied by visible gaps. Kahneman suggests that the mind doesn't measure how much information is missing when it generates that certainty. It's measured by how well the available pieces fit together. If the elements align without friction, doubt doesn't arise naturally. And if doubt doesn't arise, the slower system has little reason to intervene. This creates a structural vulnerability. The same mechanisms that allow us to form quick and coherent interpretations of the world can also generate conviction in environments where the environment is thin. The pattern's unstable and the future is far less predictable than it appears. What needs to be understood is that confidence is not a measure of truth. It's a measure of how well a story fits together.
Sit down with me real quick, because I've had a hell of a day. I'm at the top of Mount Batyr. I fucking ate shit on my motorbike, but small price to pay for an incredible view. Right now, I'm taking my Ultra Focus energy pack. Gives a little pep in the step, mental clarity. You know, I take this about 2-3 times a day, but it's whatever. But, you know, it's about the experience. All right, enough talking about myself. Back to getting better.
One of the most powerful consequences of the mind's preference for coherence is that it doesn't tolerate randomness well. When events unfold, especially complex or emotionally charged ones, we don't experience them as disconnected data points. Instead, we instinctively organize them into stories, because stories provide structure and that structure provides meaning. Kahneman refers to this tendency as the narrative fallacy, the inclination to create a coherent account of events after they occur, even when the true cases are uncertain, probabilistic, or partly random. The fallacy doesn't lie in storytelling itself. Storytelling is how humans understand experience. The distortion arises because once a story is constructed, it feels explanatory, and that feeling of explanation often substitutes for genuine understanding. When we look back on a major business success, a market crash, a political shift, or even a personal turning point, it becomes remarkably easy to identify causes. We trace lines between decisions and outcomes, highlight key moments, and describe the trajectory as if it were moving towards an identifiable conclusion all along. The story feels structured. Because of that, it feels inevitable. What tends to disappear in that reconstruction is the uncertainty that existed at the time. The alternatives that could have occurred, the role of chance, and the incomplete information available in the moment are gradually edited out. The mind prefers a clean arc to an ambiguous one. This process, of course, directly connects to the first video I did on thinking fast and slow, where in that video my focus was more on how our minds construct reality. In that video, it does a much more in-depth explanation of the two systems that this book really dives into. This first system generates coherence automatically, and system 2 rarely intervenes when a narrative fits together smoothly. Once an outcome is known, the pieces can be rearranged in a way that makes the result appear predictable. This makes what was once uncertain feel now obvious. The danger here is not merely intellectual. It shapes how we evaluate ourselves and others. When we attribute outcome to clear causes, we become more confident in our ability to explain, and by extension, to predict. A successful leader appears visionary in retrospect because the narrative now emphasizes foresight. and a failed decision appears careless because the outcome highlights its flaws. Then the randomness that influenced both fades into the background. The narrative fallacy strengthens confidence because it reduces ambiguity. When events are arranged into a casual chain, they feel understood. And when something feels understood, it feels controllable. But this clarity is often retrospective. The mind's ability to construct a convincing story after the fact doesn't mean that the story captures the true complexity of what occurred, nor does it mean that the same clarity would have been available beforehand. Once we recognize this tendency, another distortion becomes easier to see. If we reconstructed the past as more predictable than it was, then we begin to believe that we knew it all along. If the narrative fallacy explains how we organize events into coherent stories after they occur, hindsight bias explains how those stories reshape our memory of uncertainty itself. Once an outcome is known, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to reconstruct what it felt like not to know it. Kahneman describes hindsight bias as the tendency to see events as having been more predictable than they actually were. After a political election, a market movement, or a personal decision plays out, we often find ourselves thinking about the signs that were obvious, that the results were inevitable, or that we had sensed it all along. Yet if we examine our earlier predictions, we often discover that our certainty was far weaker than we now remember. The distortion doesn't arise because we're deliberately revising history. It arises because knowledge of that outcome changed how the event is presented in memory. Once we know what happened, the mind adjusts its internal model to accommodate that fact, and alternative possibilities lose psychological weight. The story narrows and the path that led to the actual outcome becomes clearer, while the paths that didn't occur become faint and difficult to imagine. This reshaping of memory reinforces confidence. If we believe that we anticipated the outcome even vaguely, we begin to trust our judgment even more. The experience of having known it strengthens our sense of competence, even if the prediction was never explicitly made or was far less certain at the time. What makes hindsight bias particularly insidious is that it also affects how we evaluate other people. When someone makes a decision that leads to a negative outcome, we are tempted to judge that decision as flawed because in retrospect, the warning signs appear obvious. We forget how ambiguous the situation may have been before the results unfolded. Conversely, when a decision leads to success, we attribute foresight and skill, even if the outcome was heavily influenced by chance. This bias is closely tied to coherence. Once the outcome is known, the narrative can be rearranged in a way that makes it seem natural, even necessary. The discomfort of uncertainty is replaced with the comfort of explanation. And because explanation feels like understanding, it strengthens the illusion that the future is more predictable than it really is. Over time, hindsight bias feeds overconfidence. If the past appears orderly and comprehensible, then the future appears more manageable. We begin to believe that we can detect patterns reliably, that we can foresee turning points, and that we understand the forces at play more clearly than we actually do. The difficulty is that this confidence is built on reconstructed memory. We aren't evaluating our predictive ability based on the uncertainty we truly faced. We're evaluating it based on a past that has already been simplified. And once we begin judging the past through this lens, another distortion follows naturally. We start evaluating decisions not by the reasoning that produced them, but by the outcomes they generated. If hindsight bias reshapes our memory of uncertainty, outcome bias reshapes how we evaluate decisions themselves, then when we know how something turned out, it becomes difficult to separate the quality of the reasoning from the quality of the results. Kahneman emphasizes that decisions are made under conditions of uncertainty. At the moment a choice is made, the outcome is unknown, and even well-reasoned decisions can lead to unfavorable results because of chance, information incompletion, and external variables that are always involved. Yet once the outcome is revealed, we tend to judge the decision by what happened rather than by the information available at the time. Let's say a risky investment yields a profit. We often describe the decision as bold or insightful. Then, when a similar investment results in a loss, we may call it reckless or poorly considered. The reasoning process behind both decisions may have been identical, but the outcome alters our perception of its quality. This distortion occurs because outcomes provide clarity, and clarity strengthens narratives. Once the result is known, it becomes the anchor around which the story is constructed. If the ending is positive, we highlight the factors that made success seem likely. And if it's negative, we highlight the warning signs that, in retrospect, seem obvious. The evaluation shifts from, was this a reasonable decision given the uncertainty, to, did it work? The problem is that this way of judging decisions gradually erodes our ability to think probabilistically. If we reward outcomes rather than reasoning, we encourage risk-taking that happens to succeed, and discourage careful judgments that happen to fail. Over time, this distorts learning. We become less sensitive to the role of randomness and more convinced that outcomes reflect skill or incompetence. Outcome bias also reinforces confidence in much of the same way hindsight bias does. When a good outcome follows a decision, it confirms the story we've constructed about our competence. That success feels earned and the reasoning feels validated. What disappears from view is the range of alternative outcomes that were possible but didn't occur. Kahneman's broader point is that evaluating decisions requires stepping back into the state of knowledge that exists at the time of choice. This is difficult because once we know the ending, we cannot unsee it. The mind automatically integrates the outcome into the narrative, and separating it from the decision process requires deliberate effort. Taken together, the narrative fallacy, hindsight bias, and outcome bias form a reinforcing cycle. We construct coherent stories about events, we rewrite the past as more predictable than it was, and then we judge decisions based on how these stories concluded. Each step strengthens the illusion that we understand more than we do. But confidence doesn't only arise from retrospective storytelling, it also arises from experience itself, and from the feeling that repeated exposure to a domain produces reliable intuition. And this is where Kahneman introduces one of the most important distinctions in the book: the difference between environments where intuition can genuinely develop expertise and environments where it merely creates an illusion of validity. Up to this point, the distortions we've examined have largely operated after the fact. We construct stories, revive memory, and judge decisions by outcomes. But Kahneman's argument becomes more unsettling when he turns to the relationship between confidence and predictive accuracy itself. One of his central claims is that confidence is a psychological state, not a statistical measure. It reflects the internal coherence of a judgment, not its correspondence with reality. In other words, we can feel certain without being accurate. And that feeling of certainty often tells us very little about whether the prediction will hold. This becomes particularly visible in domains where people rely on professional judgment. Experts often express strong convictions in their forecasts, whether in finance, politics, or organizational leadership. Yet, when those predictions are tracked over time, their accuracy frequently fails to exceed what would be expected from simple statistical models, or even from chance within a narrow range. The question then is why experience produces confidence even when it doesn't reliably produce accuracy. Kahneman introduces an important distinction here. Some environments are structured in a way that allows intuition to improve through feedback. Chess is a classic example. The rules are stable, patterns repeat, and feedback is immediately clear. In such environments, the fast system can gradually internalize regularities, and intuition becomes genuinely skilled. But not all environments shape these characteristics. In domains where outcomes are influenced by many unpredictable variables, where feedback is delayed or ambiguous, and where patterns are unstable, the conditions for developing valid intuitions become weak there. Yet the experience of making repeated judgments still generates a sense of familiarity, and familiarity feeds confidence. The mind doesn't automatically distinguish between a valid environment and a noisy one. If a pattern seems coherent, if past events can be arranged into a convincing narrative, and if decisions feel internally consistent, then confidence increases. The coherence of a story substitutes for the reliability of the prediction. What makes this especially difficult is that people often interpret their own conviction as evidence of insight. The stronger the feeling of certainty, the more persuasive it becomes, both to others and to oneself. Yet that certainty may simply reflect the absence of internal contradictions rather than the presence of predictive power. Kahneman refers to this as the illusion of validity, the sense that one's judgment are accurate because they feel coherent and because past experience can be woven into a stable narrative. The illusion persists even when statistical evidence suggests that outcomes are largely unpredictable. The broader implication is that experience alone doesn't guarantee expertise. Without stable patterns and clear feedback, intuition may become more confident without becoming more accurate. And once we recognize that confidence can detach itself from validity, another reoccurring distortion becomes easier to understand. Even when we engage the slower system deliberately, even when we attempt to plan carefully and account for uncertainty, we tend to rely on internally coherent scenarios rather than on statistical realities. That tendency appears most clearly in what Kahneman calls the planning fallacy. So if confidence can detach from accuracy, even in professional judgment, it becomes even more revealing when we examine deliberate planning. The planning fallacy doesn't occur because people are careless or impulsive. It occurs precisely when they're trying to be thoughtful. The pattern is familiar. Individuals and teams are asked to estimate how long a project will take, how much it will cost, and how likely it is to succeed. They review the steps involved, consider the resources available, and construct a detailed scenario of how the process will unfold. The estimate they produce often feels reasonable because it's internally coherent. Each stage of this connects logically to the next. The obstacles seem manageable and the timeline feels structured, and yet repeatedly those estimates prove overly optimistic. Kahneman explains this through a distinction between what he calls the inside view and the outside view. The inside view focuses on the specific details of the current case. It asks, how will this project unfold? What steps will we take? And what challenges might arrive? Because this perspective builds a narrative from within, it naturally emphasizes plans, intentions, and unique features. The outside view, in contrast, steps back from the particular case and asks, how have similar projects performed in the past? It relies on statistical distributions rather than on scenario construction. Instead of imagining how things should go, it examines how things typically go. The difficulty is that the inside view feels far more compelling. It's vivid, detailed, and coherent, which engages the imagination and creates a sense of control. The outside view, which requires abstraction away from the specific case and consulting broader data. This feels less personal and less intuitive because the mind prefers coherence and narrative. It gravitates towards the inside view. As a result, even experienced professionals repeatedly underestimate time and cost, not because they're unaware of risk, but because their forecasts are anchored in scenarios that emphasize intended actions rather than historical outcomes. The narrative makes the plan feel plausible, and that strengthens confidence. What makes the planning fallacy especially instructive is that it shows how even System 2, when engaged deliberately, can be guided by narrative rather than by statistics. This slow system doesn't automatically default to the outside view. It can reason carefully within a flawed frame. Kahneman recounts how even groups explicitly trained to recognize this bias often fail to apply the outside view when planning their own projects. The abstract knowledge of this bias doesn't automatically override the pull of a coherent scenario. The broader lesson isn't simply that people underestimate timelines, it's that the mind preferences for internal consistent stories extends into deliberate reasoning. Even when we believe we're being realistic, we're often evaluating how plausible our plan feels rather than how similar plans have actually performed. And even careful planning can be shaped by narrative rather than by statistical evidence. Then it becomes difficult to avoid a larger conclusion. Our confidence in forecasts may often reflect how well a story hangs together, but not how well it predicts. Which raises a final question. If expertise, memory, and deliberate reasoning can all generate conviction without guaranteeing accuracy, What does that say about the reliability of expert predictions more broadly? By the time Kahneman turns to expert prediction, the pattern should already feel familiar. We've seen how the mind constructs coherent stories, how it rewrites uncertainty into inevitability, and how it judges decisions by outcomes. Even how careful planning relies on internally consistent scenarios rather than statistical distributions. What remains is to examine whether professional expertise escapes these distortions, or whether it amplifies them. The natural assumption is that experience sharpens judgment. The more someone spends analyzing markets, advising governments, or managing organizations, the more refined their intuition should become. And in certain environments, as we've seen, this assumption holds. Where patterns are stable and feedback is immediate, expertise can genuinely develop. The difficulty arises in domains where the environment is noisy, outcomes are influenced by many interacting variables, and feedback is delayed or ambiguous. In such settings, even repeated exposure doesn't reliably teach the correct lessons, because it's often unclear which factors cause which outcomes. Random fluctuations can masquerade as skill, and short-term patterns can be mistaken for stable trends. Kahneman's research into long-term forecasting, particularly in political and economic contexts, revealed a striking result. Experts were often highly confident in their predictions, yet their accuracy barely exceeded that of simple statistical baselines. In some cases, the more prestigious or publicly visible expert, the stronger the confidence expressed. But that confidence didn't reliably correlate with improved predictive performance. This doesn't mean that experts are uninformed. It means that the coherence of their internal models can produce a powerful sense of understanding even when the environment doesn't permit reliable prediction. Once a narrative framework is in place, new information is interpreted within that framework. The story expands, adjusts, and reinforces itself. Contradictory evidence may be reinterpreted rather than integrated. In this sense, overconfidence isn't arrogance, it's the natural byproduct of a mind that values internal consistency. When a model of the world fits together neatly, and when past events can be arranged in a way that supports it, confidence increases. The feeling of understanding substitutes for measured predictive validity. This pattern becomes especially pronounced when public reputation is involved. Experts are often expected to provide clear answers and decisive judgments. Expressing uncertainty can be perceived as weakness. As a result, forecasts are framed with precision and conviction is communicated strongly, even when the underlying probabilities are fragile. The unsettling implication is that confidence can grow independently of accuracy, and sometimes even in spite of it. The mechanism that generates conviction, coherence, narrative, and familiarity operate just as powerfully in experts as they do in novices. When we step back and look at the structure we've uncovered in this video, a consistent thread runs through it. The mind constructs stories to make sense of events, revises memory to align with outcomes, judges decisions by results rather than reasoning, and builds confidence on the bias of internal consistency. Expertise can refine those stories, but it doesn't automatically make them predictive, which means that the certainty we experience, whether in ourselves or in others, often reflects how well a narrative fits together rather than how well it anticipates reality. When you look across the patterns we've explored, the stories we construct, the way we rewrite the past, the tendency to judge decisions by outcomes, and the confidence that grows from experience even in unstable environments, a quieter realization begins to form. That the mind doesn't generate confidence by measuring how strong the evidence is, it generates confidence when its internal narrative feels complete. When contradictions are resolved and uncertainty fades from view, conviction follows naturally. It doesn't arrive because every possibility has been weighed. It arrives because the story no longer feels fractured. And since coherence is something the mind produces automatically, the resulting certainty feels self-earned. What makes this difficult is that the experience of understanding and the reality of unpredictability can coexist. A forecast may feel grounded while still resting on fragile assumptions. A decision may appear flawed in retrospect, even though it was reasonable at the time. And a professional may speak with assurance while operating in a domain where outcomes are largely driven by chance. None of these require deception. It requires only a mind that prefers clarity to ambiguity. Kahneman's point is that confidence by itself cannot serve as proof. The feeling of being right is not the same as being right. And unless we distinguish between the coherence of a story and the validity of a prediction, we will continue to mistake one for the other. What this ultimately reveals is not a flaw in human intelligence, but a structural limitation, where we're designed to make sense of the world, and making sense of the world often feels like understanding it. The difficulty in that is that the world is frequently more uncertain than our stories allow it to be. And that gap between the clarity we feel and the uncertainty that remains is where overconfidence quietly takes root.